Much, Stephen, and thanks very much to the Public Records Office for hosting this event, and we hope you enjoy it. I have an immediate apology to make. I'm not Sam Robinson. Sam is the person who wrote the book, another lifelong Glentoran fan, and he'd written the book, which you should all get a copy of, called There's a Green Sword Called the Oval, which comes from our favourite song about Sammy Hughes. But Sam has sent his presentation along with me, a bit like the Oscars. He can't make it, so he sent me his speech. He's caught up with business and a sort of family illness, and he's got it, he can't be here. So what I intend to do is deliver the presentation abridged from Sam's book that he would have done himself, were he here, say a few words himself about Glentoran. Then we'll take a break and Alan Carr will give his presentation. So it'll be a game of three halves. You can do that in football mathematically, where David Jeffries players give you 110%. We can have three halves. I'll start Sam's presentation with that. The story of Glentoran Football Club is one of hard, honest toil, foresight, benevolence and a constant raging against adversity. The club has been in existence for 135 years and has faced many challenging and defining moments. Events foisted on it that might have broken weaker souls. And by sheer coincidence, we meet today in East Belfast on the 76th anniversary of the event that almost ended all hope for the future of the club. That event, indeed series of events, was the Belfast Blitz, and we're meeting in an area that was devastated by Hitler's specialist Luftwaffe squadron, the Kampfentrupp 100. This squadron lit up the way for over 200 bombers who disgorged a cargo of death and destruction onto the unsuspecting community that had grown around the shipyards. Civilian casualties were high, and Thorndike Street, Pims Avenue, Witham Street, Westbourne Street and the other small terraced houses around the ground suffered the most. And there's actually a picture of the devastation of Thorndike Street in the loop at a point. Places of work, places of rest, places of worship and places of leisure instantly disappeared or were transformed beyond all recognition. The Oval Stadium, home to Glentoran Football Club, mistaken as an oil storage facility in the reconnaissance flights that were made in November, crumbled under the fallout of 3 huge bombs. The very playing strip would be destroyed, along with the club records and the sepia photographs of an array of our heroes of the East captured over the preceding decades. As the stadium smouldered, word spread around the locale that the club was gone. It was finished, taken along with the innocents trapped under the wreckage. The late Malcolm Brodie, a young journalist then with the Belfast Telegraph, captured the mood perfectly. Malcolm visited the Oval in the years that followed and recorded the scene of devastation. He wrote, "There were no," I'll not do Malcolm's voice, "There were no cheering crowds that morning, no star-spangled teams, no clicking of turnstiles, no programme sellers, no refreshment stands. A battle had to be fought, a battle far tougher than any field of play, a battle against the old enemy of Glentoran, flooding water from the Conneswater River." Footballers had been replaced by swans as the children of the area navigated the lake, which had been one of the finest playing surfaces on the island. But hope was not extinguished by the Nazi bombers, and due to the resilience and character of our supporters, Glentoran Football Club was to rise like a phoenix from the ashes and to give us the memories and history that we're speaking of today. But now back to the beginning and the origins of our club. The concept of Glentoran Football Club probably came to Victor Coates as he strolled through the grounds of his splendid residence, Glentoran House, by the River Larkin in the early spring of 1882. Coates was an industrialist, a man of drive and foresight, and acknowledged Christian values. His family had owned a pottery, a glassworks, and subsequently an iron foundry. And the importance of the Coates family's contribution to the expansion of Belfast as an industrial behemoth cannot be underestimated. But fortuitously, Coates saw merit in exercise and sport as a positive distraction from the rigours of long hours and difficult conditions, and they were difficult conditions. Noting the imminent demise of 2 small local football teams, Nettlefield and Oakfield, he suggested that the 2 should merge in the summer of 1882. And by September of the year, Coates had applied to the Irish Football Association to have the new Glentoran club registered for the princely sum of £1. All correspondence with the Coates family, from the Coates family, was sealed with the family crest, which bore a distinctive French cockerel. That cockerel was soon adopted as the club's crest and is one of Glentoran's playing shirts to this very day. We were delighted then in 2014 that the Coates family returned to the Oval, bringing with them the original signet ring worn by their ancestor. We're delighted too that the Coates family remain in close contact with our club. The club's colours were determined at a meeting convened by Victor Coates in the summer of 1882 in the Hatfield House Bar in Belfast. Always glad to see bars remaining in existence too. By happy coincidence, the Phoenix Cricket Club of Dublin had retired to the bar after play, and their dashing, distinctive green, red and black blazers established that henceforth Glentoran would play in those colours. Belfast was becoming one of the fastest growing urban areas in the British Empire at that point. In 1821 the town had fewer than 40,000 inhabitants, but by 1881 that figure had risen to 210,000. Throughout the century, legislators, philanthropists and trade unionists had fought long and hard to limit the working hours for employees, and some of that agitation gave rise to the Factory Acts, and by 1880 the 5,000 workers then in the shipyard had secured a 54-hour working week. Although far from generous in today's world, certainly not for my union, this at least meant that men and women would have Saturday afternoons free from work. And remarkably, some of them found themselves with a small excess income at disposal that might be put to leisure activity. And so not only did the popularity of sport greatly expand between the years 1870 and 1900 in Belfast, so too did the popularity of theatres and music halls such as the Alhambra, the Olympia Palace, the Empire Theatre, Varieties and the Grand Opera House, still there today. But for Glentoran, it was the opening of Belfast's first public park, the Ormeau Park, that was of greatest significance in our history. Another critical factor in the creation and success of Glentoran was the influence of the Constituency River in facilitating local industry and employment. Although the smaller cousin to the River Larkin, the Connswater on the eastern boundary of Ballymacart was also surrounded by a thriving hub of productivity. By the mid-1880s, Connswater had achieved a significance all of its own, with barges travelling its length and its waters powered cotton mills and flax mills such as the Woollow Cork Mill and the Beersbridge Road. In 1873, Edward Harlan helped set up what was to become the world's biggest rope works, straddling the banks of the Connswater. The rope works would go on to employ a large female workforce from the district and beyond. In 1886, the first of two whisky distilleries opened, Irish Distillery Limited, followed by the Avenel Distillery, which produced 1 million of the 3 million barrels of spirits leaving the east at the turn of the 20th century. Significantly, its employees formed Avenel FC, the first prominent team in East Belfast in 1880. And in their 3 years of existence, and supplemented by Scottish players working in the distillery, they managed to have one of their team capped at international level and reached the semi-final of the Irish Cup in 1882. Glentoran, however, first took to the field of play in the grounds of Ormeau Park on the 7th of October 1882. That game ended in a 2-2 draw against Mount Avon. And little did Coates know then that his eclectic mix of young men drawn from different social classes, backgrounds and religions would in a short space of time overtake the Avenel Colossus. Who fears to speak of Avenel anymore? But by the end of 1884, Avenel had disbanded and many of their players had moved to join Glentoran. A house was rented on My Lady's Road, which would become the club's headquarters. New teams were registering with the Irish Football Association at an inordinate rate. Glentoran were early advocates of professionalism, and by 1894 the side had no fewer than 10 professionals on the books. The club was well organised, with 2 gentlemen looking after the secretarial duties, and soon they were attracting a considerable following. And before the commencement of the 1886-87 season, with the pitch at Ormeau unable to host the increasing crowds, Glentoran were on the move. This time it was to a ground known then as King's Field on Bryson Street, on a site that subsequently housed Templemore Avenue School. The area is now known as the Short Strand, and our club has maintained a relationship with that area, proudly having a Glentoran Supporters Club based there until recent times. 2 new secretaries were appointed with a contact address given as 215 Mount Pottinger Road, the location of the Glentoran Public House at the road's junction with Madrid Street, the landlord at the time being registered as a Mr. James Lavery. And for generations thereafter, the bar would be known as Lavery's or the Glentoran Bar. Little is known about the time spent at Kingsfield. However, in a report of a game against Clifton Park in November 1886, which the Glens would win 10-0, we don't often say that, it is stated that the playing surface was badly flooded. For the first time, the players, supporters and officials would encounter a problem. that was to become the bane of the side's existence down through the decades to come. Kingsfield, despite its location at the heart of inner East Belfast, was simply unsuitable for playing football and had to be drained specifically every time there was a game. As demand for building land was becoming ferocious, with more and more families moving in from the countryside into the city of Belfast in search of work, the landowner, Alexander King, sold the land off for social housing. And so in the summer of 1890, Glentoran once again up stakes and relocated at another expanse of waste ground 500 yards away to a place known locally as Musgraves Park. That ground had previously been used as Caledonians as a football pitch, but sadly it again shared the same issues with poor drainage. It was owned by Henry Musgrave, a prominent businessman and philanthropist who also owned a vast array of businesses and factories in Belfast. The most significant event, however, to take place at Musgrave Park was not a game of football, but instead an enormous political debate to garner support for the Conservative Shipyard owner Gustav Wolff, who was standing for election to the Westminster Parliament in 1892. An advertisement placed in the Northern Wig announced a rally of support for Mr Wolff to be held on the 1st of March 1892, and here we see the first tangible connection between the proprietor of the Harlan Wolff Shipyard and the local football club. A sense of identity had developed in the east between the Glens, the community and the yard. Gustav Wolff's appreciation for the support he received from the electors of East Belfast on winning the seat would manifest itself in a commitment to invest in Glentoran Football Club a decade later. A larger-than-life character, he once famously said he was involved in the shipbuilding industry in the East, that Sir Edward Harlan builds the ships, Mr Perry makes the speeches, and as for me, I smoke the cigars. Henry Musgrave's decision to build a foundry on the site of the field he owned forced the team to move again. And with the Coates family connection all but gone, and with Glentoran struggling to find a home with any degree of permanency, it was the intervention of another benefactor which would secure our future. Sir Daniel Dixon was a phenomenal presence in Belfast, a property developer, a factory owner, and the driving force behind the rail link between Belfast and Bangor. He was also a Conservative politician who had served as Lord Mayor on 4 occasions. He lived in the glacial splendour of a house in the grounds of what is today known as Ballymennock Park in Hollywood. Significantly for Glentoran, he realised the benefit a successful football team would bring to the community of East Belfast, and even more significantly, he owned quite a substantial portion of land in Ballymacarrat, including a vast expanse of wasteland in the shadow of the Harlan Wolff Shipyard. In November 1892, he signed a long-term lease with Glentoran on a plot of ground, the required size for a football pitch in that location. The Oval, as it was to become labelled due to its shape, was opened on Christmas Eve 1892 with a game against Kilmarnock from Scotland, which ended in a 1-1 draw. The Belfast Newsletter reported on a friendly game between Glentoran and Linfield, played on January the 10th, 1893. But the problem again, spectators were forced or afforded no cover and would be required to stand in the open in all weathers. And again, we had to set up a fundraising committee to help with facilities at that location. In February 1894, during a game against Linfield, flooding at the ground left 2,500 supporters knee-deep in mud and water. On some occasions, though, the Oval was dry and playable, and on the 10th of March 1894, a travelling circus troupe arrived in Mersey Street. The Genet family were of French extraction, having been captured by the British during the Napoleonic War. Originally great horse people, they were thought to be the high ranks of the French cavalry. Brought to England on prison ships, they soon established a show business act, which became a travelling circus. And the troupe's first visit to Belfast would be heralded in the Belfast Newsletter. The advertisement announced the Genet's clowns in character, by kind permission of Claude Genet, would play Glentoran in character, with the kick-off set for 3:30 in the afternoon, before the clowns returned to perform in the Belfast city centre along with the other acts that evening. There is no record of the score, but it was not the last appearance of clowns on the fields of the I put those words in myself. Incredibly, a gentleman by the name of Ted Genet, a descendant of the Napoleonic horsemen, still lives more than 500 yards from the ground. 1895 brought an international gala and carnival to the Oval, which included the wonderful water shoot, like we needed more water. The advertisements proclaimed at the time that this edifice was an endless attraction, with thousands flocking to see it and hundreds unable to gain access. Admission would cost a visitor 3D, for those of you who know what 3D is, with the Connswater and Sydenham trams depositing the hordes that flocked to the experience at Hornby Street. Alas, a year later, representatives of the club were in court defending an unpaid bill of £76 owed to the owner of the tent used for the gala. Glentoran argued that income to the club had been affected by the strikes in Belfast when almost 3,000 workers walked out of Harlan and Wolff. The club asked the judge if a £1 per month payment could be made to the plaintiff, with that increasing to £3 when the football season began. The judge thought that this was reasonable and agreed to the arrangement. By 1897, the club's pavilion had become dilapidated again, and visiting teams were forced into getting changed at Templemore Avenue at the public baths, well over a mile away, and trekking to the ground in their full kit. At the close of the century, the club found itself at a crossroads. In 1898, Glentoran would have its worst ever season, winning only 2 of the 21 games they played. But still, crowds of between 8,000 and 10,000 spectators would still cram themselves into Glentoran's ground, but despite what was recognised as its go-ahead spirit, the East Belfast outfit continued to struggle financially. All manner of schemes, including fancy dress parties, carnivals, dog shows, bird shows, bicycle races, athletics meeting, dancing, women's football matches, legends games, or as they would be known in the 20s, antiques matches, were all organised in a bid to raise money to keep both the club and the stadium afloat. During its formative years, Glentoran managed to keep its head above water, but only just. And then came a proposal to float Glentoran FC as a public company. The driving force behind that initiative was two giants of Irish industry, William Perry, the chairman of Harlan Wolff Shipyard, and his partner Gustav Wolff, who was at the time a member of Parliament for East Belfast. Both agreed to take up 400 shares in the new company, and with assurances provided by Perry and Wolff, a prospectus was published in March 1902. With great foresight, Glentoran Recreation Company Limited released 3,000 shares priced at £1 each. But uniquely, shareholders would only have to pay 5 shillings on each application, another 5 shillings on allocation, with the remaining 10 shillings only ever being recalled by the company if required. In one action, the Glentoran Committee had given the ordinary unskilled labour employed in the shipyard, the rope works, the distillery and institutions such as the Victoria Weaving Company on Severn Street the opportunity to have a say and become an owner of the glens. The same opportunity is that of Tom Mallon, the cycle dealer, Owen McMahon, the publican and owner of the Great Eastern Bar, Bryce McElroy, who would sit in Belfast Corporation, Saxon J. Pine, a councillor for Victoria Ward, and most remarkably of all, James Craig, the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, who would acquire his shares when he became Secretary of the Belfast Conservative Association. All these men, working class, middle class, upper class, unskilled, semi-skilled or highly skilled artisans, could stand shoulder to shoulder at the Oval every other weekend and cheer on the Glens. The share issue allowed the club to feed a first-class football team, and it was hoped to build a stadium complete with a running track, cycle track and proper covering facilities and a pavilion for changing. Again, with the agreement of Sir Daniel Dixon, Glentoran Football Club relocated several hundred yards away whilst still remaining on Dixon's estate. James Craig donated a cheque for £50 to help with the acquisition of the new plot of land, and plans were unveiled to realign the pitch and give it the alignment that it has today with a city end and a Sydenham end. On the 18th of May 1903, the Belfast Evening Telegraph ran with the headline that Glentoran's new ground, complete with new playing surface, is complete. The similar oval shape of the arena would remain as would the name. In the Monday the 17th of August edition of the Belfast Evening Telegraph, Ralph of the Rovers, as he styled himself, looked forward to the new season in somewhat breathless words. No club has gone about its business this year in a more quiet, unostentatious manner than Glentoran, and that they are working wonders in the East End district. It is no exaggeration to say that the prospects of the team transcend anything hitherto associated with the good old Ballymacarrick club. It would certainly have been a pity had the good management of the club, or had the management of the club, after taking the great responsibility of laying out the new grounds in such an elaborate manner, adopted a cheese pairing policy in connection with the formations of their football team, which after all should be the principal source of their revenue. For the information of those that have not visited the new Oval, I may say that the transformation in one short season from what was practically a wilderness into a really ideal football enclosure is simply marvellous, and not only reflects credit on the contractor, Mr. Kirker G. Walker, but also on those officials who have spared neither time nor money to achieve the success that has now been secured. The irony is the Walker family to this day still stand at the Sydenham end of the Oval watching their beloved Glens through rain, hail and shine. Glentoran's Football Club and its destiny had come to be underwritten through investment then by everyone from the shipyard labourer to the political and industrial elite of the city. Nonetheless, to go to a Glentoran game at the beginning of the 20th century was not without colour. Excuse me. A writer for the Belfast Telegraph described the 1,800 spectators who travelled to Larkin in 1912 as Ballymacarrett men, marked by the grimness associated with toil fresh from the Queen's Island shipyards. When in Dublin, the disciples of the East Belfast team were labelled as average Belfast working men of the bring your can with you species and gentlemen of the paint your town red variety. I'm sure there are none of those in the room. Overcrowding and disturbance at the ground remained a major concern for the next few years, with crowds spilling onto the pitch on a regular basis, but there were few of any instances during the formative years of Glentoran playing at the Oval when sectarianism was suggested as a cause for the trouble, even as political tension was rising across Ireland in 1912. And even though the Oval was a venue for a rally against Home Rule in 1912, Glentoran Football Club was by no means exclusively Protestant. Catholic players were not excluded from the team, nor were Catholic and nationalist shareholders prevented from taking their places on the Glentoran board. In the first decades of the club's existence, it moved quickly to help the community in which it was ensconced. In 1899, Glentoran donated 10% of its gate receipts from a home game against Cliftonville to the Widows and Orphans Fund, set up to help relatives of soldiers killed during the Boer War. In 1911, the Glens played a game to raise money for the Belfast Milk Fund, which provided milk for the underprivileged children. The Ulster Hospital Building Fund, the Belfast Veterans Relief Fund, the RNLI, the Hospital for Sick Children in Queen Street, and the Belfast Cripples Institute all benefited from collections taken amongst the supporters of the Oval on a regular basis. That's proudly an activity that continues to this day. The Glens had become one of the most highly successful sports concerns in Ireland, and the stadium was considered a mecca of all sportsmen. Although Glentoran had won the Irish League on 5 occasions before the outbreak of the First World War, one trophy had eluded them, the Irish Cup. It was the blue ribbon tournament within Irish football, and with crowds of more than 14,000 turned up for games at the Oval and with the club flying high, the directors of Glentoran decided to make a concerted attempt to bring the cup back to East Belfast in the spring of 1914. The side remained predominantly made up of East Belfast lads, many of whom worked in the shipyard trades, and most of the team that took to the field at the commencement of the 1913-14 season would have undoubtedly worked on the Titanic, the most famous ship ever built. One look at the details of the player register for 1911-1912 lists the trades of the lads who played. Fitters, caulkers, shipwrights, platers, painters and shipyard labourers. The Glens demolished the Blues 3-1 in the 1914 Irish Cup. I'll say it again. The Glens demolished the Blues 3-1 in the 1914 Irish Cup final to lift the Irish Cup for the first time. The win wouldn't turn lead to a bizarre and unsolicited and immediate invitation from the Austro-Hungarian FA, arriving at the Oval and asking the East Belfast side to travel to Vienna, Berlin, Prague and Bratislava, and that was to take on some of the finest sides then in European football. That was to be in May and June of 1914. And so Glentoran, as well as Celtic, the winners of the Scottish Cup, and Burnley, the winners of the FA Cup, accepted the invite. Glentoran set sail for Europe from Larne Harbour on Monday, the 18th of May 1914. They would traverse 4 European countries in the weeks that followed, incredibly defeating teams of the calibre of the famous Hertha Berlin in the German capital by 4-1. One of the Glentoran directors was wealthy enough, affluent enough to possess a camera and took a nice photo of the Glentoran side in repose at the Hotel Continental in Vienna before they would go on to defeat a Vienna Select 11. In turn, Glentoran would become the first British side to win an officially recognised European trophy presented by the Austro-Hungarian FA. The Glens returned to the Oval with that trophy, which is now known as the Vienna Cup, and that remains in the boardroom at Glentoran. We're very proud of it. In the early summer of 1914, however, trouble was stirring on the European mainland, not so far away from where Glentoran were having great success in the field of play. Glentoran fled Austria in great haste and panic after the tournament, making way for the English Channel through Belgium as the first sparks of World War I hissed and crackled in Vienna and Sarajevo. The Glentoran side sailed home not knowing that a few months later thousands of lads from East Belfast and elsewhere would begin to make the crossing back across the Irish Sea and the English Channel, this time for war. Interest in the game during the war years progressively waned, and the sight of many injured soldiers in hospital blue in the oval terraces was a poignant reminder of what was going on in the fields of France and in the rocky beaches of Gallipoli. Many of the players were employed in munitions production, and whilst football continued, the purpose in many instances was really to raise funds for various war-related causes, such as the Ulster Patriotic Fund, the Limbless Soldiers Fund, and the Lord Roberts workshops. Games on Mersey Street were on many occasions used as recruiting opportunities, with military bands in attendance and patriotic speeches issued at various parts of the grass banking. Now, the armistice of November the 11th, 1918 saw the end of the Great War, but one can only contemplate the sadness and sense of loss in the atmosphere that accompanied the first competitive games after that. The thrill of football had returned, but whilst the spectre of conflict in a foreign field had faded, murderous conflict at home would soon replace it. Northern Ireland came into being in a violent and turbulent manner, and in the 2 years between the Government of Ireland Act 1920 and the newly established Irish Free State in 1922, no less than 557 people were murdered because of political or sectarian violence. The trouble raging in the streets of Belfast would cast a deadly shadow over the Oval in a sombre period of just over a month in 1922. Northern Ireland had been partitioned from the south for less than a year. However, the period immediately before and after the separation of the two countries was marked by a major sectarian conflict in Belfast. In that time, 90% of the 465 deaths in the province were civilians. On Saturday evening of the 4th of March 1922, a young man named Isaac Roadside McMillan was passing a picture house on the Lower Newtonards Road when a man appeared at Young's Row and fired a revolver at him. McMillan was wounded in the head and died an hour later in hospital. It was recorded at the time that McMillan, a 22-year-old Protestant, was coming from the Oval with a group of Glentoran supporters. However, no game was being played by the Glens that day. But during this time, several high-profile Ulster Unionist politicians held rallies at the Oval on Wednesday, the 18th of May 1921, for example. The East Belfast division of the Ulster Ex-Servicemen's Association hosted what was described as a monster rally and demonstration at the Oval. The report in Northern Whig portrays a fascinating picture of the heightened political tension at the time. Held under the auspices of an inspection of the veterans by Lieutenant Colonel Sir James Craig, who was accompanied by his wife, the rally was in fact to promote the 4 Ulster Unionist candidates standing for election to the first Northern Ireland Parliament, to be held a week later on the 24th of May. 20,000 supporters, not necessarily of Glentoran but of the candidates, gathered at 4 mustering points within East Belfast, with all 4 rallies emerging at Hollywood Arches, accompanied by bands, under a banner proclaiming, "Loyalists, your votes are needed to ensure the safe launch of the Ulster ship." The inspection took place on the playing surface, but the drive behind the gathering was, quote, to stir up the electorate of East Belfast to the highest pitch. Surely we'd never see that sort of thing again. The Whig reported that, quote, "seldom if ever have the people of East Belfast been galvanised into such a state of fervour." A week later, all 4 Unionist candidates, Bates, Dixon, Donald and Duff, were elected. The Dixon in question was Sir Herbert Dixon, the 4th son of the late Sir Daniel Dixon, Glentoran Football Club's first landlord. Notwithstanding the use of the ground for such Unionist rallies, Nationalists also felt sufficiently comfortable within its confines, both as supporters and directors of the club, and one such example was that of Owen McMahon and his family. The McMahons owned the Capstan Bar on Ann Street, the International Bar at the corner of Donegal Street, the Century Bar on Garfield Street, and most importantly for us, the Great Eastern Bar at the junction of D Street and Lower Newtonards Road. The McMahons advertised the Great Eastern in the newspapers at the time, advising Glentoran supporters that they'd be foolish not to visit the pub on match days due to the vicinity to the ground. In 1922, both Owen McMahon and his son Bernard were shareholders in the Glentoran Recreation Company. The family then moved from a house in Newtonards Road across the city to a substantial 3-storey residence at Canary Terrace, short distance from Carlisle Circus. It was widely accepted that the McMahons were a Catholic family, old school nationalists described at the time. On Thursday the 23rd of March, a cold, miserable day in the city, the poor weather continued late into the evening. The city remained tense with murder and civil unrest still an everyday occurrence. With the capstan finally closed its doors that night, Owen McMahon and his bar manager Edward McKinney knocked up and made their way home, towards their home. McMahon sat down for tea and later retired to bed. Owen, his 6 sons, his wife, his niece, their domestic staff and Edward McKinney all lived at the house. At around 1:20 the next morning, 5 men entered the Glentoran director's home by force, sledging in the front door. The intruders rounded up the womenfolk, ushering them into a back room on the first floor before gathering the men and assembling them in the parlour. The Belfast Telegraph report on the incident stated that the leader of the gang is purported to have told them to avail themselves of the few moments left to pray for their souls before the gang opened fire. Owen McMahon, his sons Thomas, Frank and Patrick, along with Edward McKinney, died in a hail of bullets. Such was the scene of horror at Kinnaird Terrace that an ambulance man collapsed with shock on his arrival at the house. Bernard McMahon survived the initial attack but died of his wounds on the 2nd of April 1922. And in the space of 19 days, 3 Glentoran supporters, 1 Protestant, 2 Catholic, bound by love for their football team, would die in the streets of Belfast. In 1923, the stadium remained isolated and only accessible by a path that stretched across wasteland from the newly emerging Mersey Street, the main road into the Congswater distillery. By the beginning of the season, Glentoran Football Club were feeling the effects of recession and admission prices were reduced to encourage attendance. By the end of the decade, both the distilleries had closed and with large numbers of workers unemployed, the disposable income that had fueled the fires of interest in the club had died away. The team also found itself in the doldrums, winning only 1 trophy between 1925 and 1929. So this was now a club and a community down on its luck. The winning of the Irish League in 1924-25 was tempered by appalling crowd attendances, with in one instance takings from a game against Linfield totalling only £70. To add insult to injury, the harsh winter winds of 1924 blew the roof off completely. Of course, there were happier times too during instances when, for example, battleships would visit from the United States Navy. They would glide into the loch, and Glentoran was keen to extend a hand of friendship, and it opened up the club to allow the sailors to play baseball, a game that had never been seen on the oval turf. Football in the city of Belfast during the late autumn and early winter of 1932 was played out against a backdrop of strike and civil disturbance. The Wall Street crash, the American stock market, had hit industrialised countries harder than most, and Northern Ireland's 2 principal industries, textile and shipbuilding, had taken a hammering. With thousands of working class men in the city forced out onto outdoor relief schemes, essentially hard labour for a pittance of pay, tensions rose in every district of the inner city, including the east. Working class unity brought thousands onto the streets as trouble flared night after night. Surplus income was gone and pastimes such as football would suffer. Nonetheless, the stadium committee forged ahead as best it could. And then on the 3rd of September 1939, Neville Chamberlain broadcast to the nation that Britain was again at war with Germany. The world was about to change forever, as indeed would the story and the fortunes of Glentoran Football Club. Slowly the people of the city began to come to terms with the realisation that the country was once again involved in hostilities with the might of Germany. There would undoubtedly be heightened concerns about the threat of a Nazi invasion. It wouldn't be long before Germany fixed its sights on Northern Ireland, but the bombers could never reach Belfast, could they? But as we've already mentioned, they did. Constantly the underdog, constantly facing into adversity, Glentoran Football Club looked to the community that enveloped its breached walls, demolished stands and flooded pitch to rebuild. A Back to the Oval committee was formed. The community was not found wanting. For 8 years, the people of the locality raised funds, traded clothing coupons for playing kit, and in some instances, such as the case of Paddy Waters, built the club back up from the ground day after day, brick by brick. Waters, a tough defender, had come from Dublin in 1946 to play for Glentoran, who were now temporarily resident in Grosvenor Park as guests of distilling. Pupils of Mersey Street School recounted how Paddy Mary Waters, a big Catholic lad from Dublin, would appear every day at the mangled oval and begin to work on the perimeter wall on his own. Thanks to him and thousands like him, Glentoran returned to Mersey Street on the 9th of August 1949. The day dawned on a brand new era. The thousands who worked in the yard and the shipyard and the aircraft factory continued to stream through the turnstiles throughout the 50s and 60s. At the club's pinnacle, almost 40,000 people crammed into every conceivable vantage point to see John Colerane's Glentoran take on the mighty Benfica and Rangers. The lads from East Belfast crossed America in a groundbreaking trailblazing tour in 1967, playing as the Detroit Cougars. And by the end of that season, Glentoran were rightly acknowledged as the richest football club on the island of Ireland. There was a forward-thinking group of directors in place, and state-of-the-art social club was packed with thirsty locals and supporters almost every night of the week. The glitterati of European football continued to grace the oval pitch. Ajax from the Netherlands, Juventus, the Italian millionaire playboys all took to the stage under the watchful eyes of Samson and Goliath. The outbreak of the Troubles, though, had taken its toll on attendance as an economic downturn and a shift in population hit Glentoran more heavily, I believe, than many other clubs. In 2010, as for a second time, the club found itself staring into oblivion with a winding up order initiated by HM Revenue and Customs. But once again, that never say die spirit took a hold, and once again Glentoran was recognised with a generous donation by a mutual benefactor, and we stepped away from the brink. A community that had watched distilleries, ropeworks, shipbuilding, aircraft manufacture rise and fall could ill afford to witness the demise of the last symbol of its identity. With a sense of caring for others first observed in those early donations to the Ulster Hospital Building Fund, the Veterans Fund and others, our supporters funded projects operating from the streets around the stadium to as far afield as groundbreaking football academy for children in the scrublands of Sunyani in central Ghana. Glentoran is in the blood. To know the Glentoran spirit is to know East Belfast and the people who live there, who are proud to have been raised in the narrow streets of its locale. The ties that bind Glentoran Football Club to the community are simply too strong to break, and it's incumbent on us all to maintain them. 50 years ago this year, we achieved the unthinkable by holding the imperious Rangers to a 1-1 draw at the Oval on a night when the World and his wife pushed through the turnstiles. The game became the talk of East Belfast. Journalists battered on the doors of local men such as James Dickey of Frome Street, William Gilmore from D Street and Mrs. Stewart from Julius Street. Their opinions of the game all made the local newspapers in the days that followed. The last word on the exploits of the most unique of football teams I leave to Mrs. Doris McNally from 37 Oval Street. Her words as poignant today as they were almost 50 years ago. As a community, East Belfast are incredibly proud of the local team, she insisted. In East Belfast, the fans refer to the club as we. It is this spirit and love of the club which has carried Glentoran to the top. We just won't hear talk of defeat. Thank you.
In this presentation, I'll try to identify and illustrate three general themes. First, the emergence of working class capacity for self-organisation, demonstrated by the creation of autonomous, democratic and class-based structures, including trade unions, political parties and sporting and cultural organisations like Glentoran Football Club. Second, the ability of these organisations to take vigorous independent action when necessary, for example, to demonstrate, to strike, to contest elections, but also a capacity to negotiate deals with representatives of other classes, such as their employers and the political establishment, when it was in their interest to do so. This ability is demonstrated by the negotiation of collective agreements in industry and the negotiation of mutually beneficial political compromises, such as the joint, believe it or not, Labour, Communist and Ulster Unionist recruitment rallies which took place during the Second World War. The emergence of Glentoran Football Club in the late 19th century represented just such an accommodation between working class participants and establishment figures who could provide the resources necessary to facilitate the project. Third, the emergence of Glentoran as an anti-sectarian football club, unlike its two major local rivals. Glentoran was founded in 1882, the same year as the Belfast United Trades and Labour Council, which was established to provide for the first time a united industrial and political voice for the working class. The council nominated its first Labour parliamentary candidate in 1885. The early Labour movement was heavily influenced by liberalism, and at that time liberalism was also the dominant political creed of the local captains of industry. The impressive Ulster Reform Club in Royal Avenue was opened as the party's headquarters in 1885. Both organised labour and big business were the interests reflected in the creation of Glentoran Football Club, and both of those interests were anti-sectarian. The labour movement because sectarianism disrupted workers' unity and power, the big businessmen because sectarian conflict was bad for business. By contrast, Linfield Football Club was founded in 1886 when the introduction of the first Home Rule Bill raised nascent sectarian tensions to new and unprecedented levels. Belfast Celtic, representing the other side of the sectarian divide, followed on shortly in 1891 in the run-up to the second Home Rule Bill, 1893. Both of those clubs reflected the environment into which they were born. I will run through some of the main historical events which illustrate these themes, and I'll introduce this by reading a short extract from a poem by Thomas Cairnduff, a working class poet and playwright who was born on the Lower Ormer Road, close to the Hatfield House pub, which, as Michael told you, was where Glentoran Football Club was founded. This poem encapsulates the positive, progressive and forward-looking atmosphere of the early 1880s. And this outlook was shared both by the emerging labour movement and by some, if not all, of the liberal establishment. The mighty deeds of bygone days live but in history's page, and graceful arts portray the great gifts of each successive age. But how can man enrich the soil by worshipping the past? It was not thus how men produced the shipyards of Belfast. The years surrounding the foundation of Glentoran FC and the Trades and Labour Council witnessed the emergence of a modern labour movement in Belfast. The movement was not yet socialist in orientation. Its ideology was anti-landlord rather than anti-capitalist, and this facilitated a political alliance between the emerging labour movement and Ulster liberalism, which was challenging the domination of Ulster politics by the conservative landed interest. In 1885, Alexander Bowman was selected by the Trades Council as the first Labour candidate in Belfast, first in Ireland, and one of the first in the UK. He was a member of the Ulster Liberal Party as well as Secretary of the Trades Council, and his candidacy was supported by the main Liberal newspaper in Belfast, the Northern Whig, which those of you of my generation will recall. He took 25% of the vote in North Belfast, a remarkably strong beginning for a new movement, and a result that any Labour candidate would die for these days. Christmas Eve 1892 saw the relocation of Glentoran to the Oval, an event celebrated by a 1-1 draw against Scottish club Kilmarnock. And the years that followed that event witnessed some of the most momentous events in the history of the East Belfast working class. In 1893, the Independent Labour Party was formed at a conference in Bradford. The word independent indicated that Labour was now breaking free from liberalism and was beginning to embrace socialism. Belfast wasn't represented at that conference, but later that year, the Trade Union Congress met in Belfast for the first time, and also for the first time adopted a resolution committing the Congress to socialism. And this inspired the establishment of a Belfast branch of the ILP in 1894. And independent labour was on the march in industry as well as politics. The years 1894 and 1895 witnessed the emergence of a rank-and-file shop stewards movement within the shipbuilding and engineering industry centred in East Belfast. This paralleled similar developments in Great Britain, principally in Glasgow and in Sheffield. On October the 11th, 1895, the Belfast shop stewards called a strike, demanding the restoration of a pay cut imposed 2 years earlier and a reduction in working hours. In retaliation, and in order to put financial pressure on the union, the Regional Engineering Employers Federation locked out shipbuilding and engineering workers in Glasgow. This dispute continued for 15 weeks and was one of the most significant events in the creation of a modern member-led trade union movement in the UK. On January the 15th, 1896, the workers were forced back to work undefeated, when the national leadership of the engineering union withdrew strike pay contrary to the rules of their own union. The Belfast shop stewards didn't, however, take this betrayal lightly. In March 1896, they took the issue to the annual conference of the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, and as a result, the General Secretary of that union, John Anderson, was summarily dismissed for what was described as willful neglect of duty. He was replaced by George Barnes, who was the first Socialist General Secretary of the Union. And shortly afterwards, in July 1897, Barnes repeated the Belfast tactic of 2 years earlier and launched a campaign for an 8-hour day, supported by coordinated local strike action. The National Engineering Employers Federation, which had been formed in response to the Belfast strike of 1895, responded by imposing a national lockout, which continued until January 1896. A few Belfast employers supported this lockout, but not the owners of Harlan, Wolff and many others, who had no appetite for a replay of the lengthy dispute of 1895. And their caution was probably reinforced by a huge trade union demonstration in Ormeau Park on the site of the first ever Glentoran football match, which according to the Belfast newsletter was attended by 40,000 workers, most of them from East Belfast. Barnes, the General Secretary who spoke, described it as the largest demonstration he had ever seen outside the City of London on behalf of a Labour object. The 8-hour day campaign, unfortunately, eventually went down to defeat, but East Belfast held out to the end and remained the strongest and best organised heartland of the British shipbuilding and engineering industry. In August 1903, Glentoran celebrated their final, at least for the present, relocation a short distance down Mersey Street to the new Oval with a convincing 3-0 win over the King's Own Scottish Borderers. The match was kicked off by Sir Daniel Dixon, as we've heard, local big businessman, Glentoran benefactor, and indeed founder of the Lord Glentoran dynasty, which remains with us to this day. The next 2 years after that were to witness two epic electoral contests between Dixon and another East Belfast man, William Walker, a shipyard joiner, a trade unionist, and the leader of the Belfast Independent Labour Party. Circumstances dictated that the venue for their contest would be North rather than East Belfast. In August 1905, the death of Sir James Haslett, the sitting Unionist MP for North Belfast, triggered a by-election in the constituency. This created an opportunity for Walker and Dixon to cross swords, though they had to cross the river to do so. The election was regarded as a great opportunity for the fledgling Independent Labour Party, which in little more than a decade had established itself as a major presence in the city of Belfast. It had regular mass meetings, a socialist cycling club to try to spread the word to rural areas, and a network of socialist Sunday schools with alternative hymn books. That little red book isn't the thoughts of Chairman Mao, it's the Socialist Sunday School hymn book, which was owned by my great aunt. It's dated 1902. I'll read a couple of verses from one of the hymns just to give you a flavour for the sort of ideas that were in common circulation at the time. Come then, worn and weary, come then, stout and brave, join this noble army, sworn our land to save. From the power of tyrants, from the curse of greed, down with the destroyer, crush the serpent's seed. As somebody once said, why should God have all the good tunes? Walker's campaign was supported by many leading British socialists, including Ramsay MacDonald, who was regarded at the time as the leading socialist orator of his generation. The result was close. Walker took over 47% of the vote in what was regarded as a rock-solid Unionist seat. Dixon's majority was a mere 474. Shortly afterwards, in January 1906, the general election of that year presented an opportunity for a quick replay, and the outcome was closer still. Walker took almost 49% of the poll and cut Dixon's majority to a mere 291. It's arguable, in fact, that Walker would have won the seat either in 1905 or 1906 had he had the good sense to ignore a sectarian questionnaire from the Belfast Protestant Association. Unfortunately, fear or opportunism got the better of him, and he gave the BPA the assurances they were seeking on such issues as the Protestant succession, thus alienating the small but significant Catholic electorate in the North Belfast constituency. Dixon, who was a former Liberal and in fact still described himself as a Liberal Unionist, and was also a former Lord Mayor and by far the more experienced campaigner, did have the good sense to ignore that questionnaire, and that is probably the reason for his narrow victory. Short time after this, in March 1907, Dixon died, and that gave Walker a third, and as it turned out, final chance to win a seat in Parliament. But by this time, however, the real opportunity had passed. A Liberal government had been returned in the general election of 1906, and that meant that the Home Rule bogey resurfaced, causing many electors to return to their traditional political trenches. In that election, Walker was defeated by over 1,800 votes. He subsequently moved to Leith, but later returned home and is buried in Dundonald Cemetery. Later in that year, in May 1907, the emphasis moved back to the industrial front, with which one of the biggest industrial disputes ever seen in Belfast, the so-called Dockers and Carters strike, led by the recently arrived and later legendary leader, Jim Larkin. The dispute was over union recognition and was bitterly fought to the end. The employers tried to break the strike by importing blacklegs from England and Scotland, and this gave rise to violent conflict. This turned out to be the last straw for the local police, who had their own grievances over pay and pensions. It provoked them, the police, into taking the unprecedented step of going on strike themselves. This was one of the very few examples of a police strike anywhere in the UK. Unfortunately, these strikes went down to defeat. The police were members of the All-Ireland Royal Irish Constabulary and were punished for going on strike by being redeployed to remote parts of Ireland. Some of them were sent as far afield as Tory Island, and they were replaced on the streets of Belfast by the army. The Dockers and Carters dispute eventually petered out, accompanied by an upsurge in sectarianism, which was partly caused by the presence of the army and partly due to deliberate incitement and the use of divide and rule tactics by the press and the employers. The years after this, leading up to the First World War, were dominated by conflict over the Third Home Rule Bill, and political labour was once again forced into the background. However, as we've heard from Michael, the achievements of Glentoran lightened the gloom during this period when they became the first team for the UK to win a European trophy. Glasgow Celtic and Manchester United eat their hearts out, lifting the Vienna Cup in the Austrian capital just a few weeks before the outbreak of war. These years leading up to the First World War also witnessed the emergence of an active suffragette movement in Ulster. Unfortunately, I don't have time to deal with this today, and as I've suggested to Stephen, it might form the basis for a future event in the Public Records Office. But suffice it to say now that the women had absolutely nothing to learn from the men in the way of militancy. Their targets included a UVF training centre in East Belfast and another in North Belfast. The suffragettes particularly targeted the UVF for attack because they had a commitment from the Ulster Unionist Council when they were making plans for the creation of a provisional government in Ulster in the event of Home Rule coming into effect, had a pledge from them that any Ulster Parliament would give votes to women. However, that commitment was vetoed by Sir Edward Carson, and the women felt betrayed and sold out by the fact that Carson wasn't prepared to honour a previously given commitment. The suffragettes also targeted a number of sporting clubs which were male only and discriminated against women. They included a number of tennis clubs and a number of golf clubs, and the Knock Golf Club in East Belfast, in fact, was burnt to the ground. Fortunately, Glentoran Football Club wasn't perceived to be an enemy of women's suffrage, nor indeed was any other football club. There was a resurgence of labour activism immediately after the First World War. The post-war general election of December 1918, known in Britain as the khaki election, when people were homes fit for heroes to live in and so on, a pledge that was sadly dishonoured. But it's best remembered in Ireland as the Sinn Féin election, when that party displaced the old Irish Parliamentary Party as the leading voice of Irish nationalism. But that wasn't so in Belfast, where Sinn Féin got a mere 7% of the vote. By contrast, the three Labour candidates, all fighting constituencies which were at least partially in East Belfast, got 17% of the vote in Crummock, 20% in Pottinger, and 27% in Victoria. So in East Belfast, at least, class issues were returning to the fore, industrially as well as politically. On January 25th, 1919, as we return to the industrial front, and led once again by their local shop stewards, 50,000 shipbuilding, engineering and corporation workers in Belfast downed tools in a resume campaign for the 8-hour day. Their slogan was 44 and no more. Traditionally, workers worked half days on Saturdays, which allowed them to either play or watch football on Saturday afternoons, hence the 44-hour week, not the 40-hour week. The Belfast shop stewards toured the country to spread this campaign, and within days 100,000 workers were on strike on the Clyde, and soon after that the dispute spread to just about every industrial city in the UK. The leaders of the Manchester strikers thanked the East Belfast men for what they called the Splendidly given. And this campaign quickly assumed the characteristics of a general strike. In fact, it was the closest the UK has come to a revolution since the 17th century. In Belfast, the strike committee, which was sometimes called the Labour Parliament, sometimes called the Belfast Soviet, published its own newspaper called the Workers' Bulletin, and organised the distribution of food and fuel. Even employers needed permits from the Labour Parliament or Belfast Soviet to visit their own factories. The response from the state, however, was vigorous. Tanks were deployed on the streets of Glasgow to intimidate the strikers back to work, and within 4 weeks the strike began to crumble. The Belfast men voted to continue, but couldn't hope to win in isolation. And on 20th of February, the shop stewards led their members back to work, but they returned undefeated. And the fact that they were undefeated was illustrated by their success in Belfast City Council elections in January 1920, when they achieved the best result ever achieved by Labour candidates in Belfast. They won 13 of the 60 seats on Belfast Corporation. Regrettably, however, this resurgence of Labour could not withstand external pressure. Within a few months, by March 1920, Belfast and the whole of Ulster was embroiled in the naked sectarian warfare which surrounded the establishment of the two states in Ireland. Labour and trade union representatives were less well-known victims of the conflict. Many of the shop stewards who had led the 1919 strike were denounced as rotten prods and expelled from their workplaces. And football wasn't immune either. On St Patrick's Day 1920, an Irish Cup semi-final between Glentoran and Belfast Celtic had to be abandoned following serious rioting at Solitude. At one point, a Celtic supporter fired gunshots towards the Glentoran supporters. And in March 1922, as Michael has mentioned, Glentoran once again became the subject of sectarian attack when Great Eastern bar owner and club director Owen McMahon and his family, all Catholics, were massacred in their home off the Antrim Road. And worse was to follow. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the devastating impact of sectarian civil war was succeeded by the even greater impact of economic collapse across the capitalist world. Northern Ireland and Industrial East Belfast in particular suffered much more severely than other parts of the UK. In Great Britain, economic recovery began in 1932. In Belfast, on the other hand, unemployment didn't even reach its peak until 1938, and there was no real recovery until well into the Second World War. The focus of trade union and labour activity during this period was on trying to improve conditions for the vast army of unemployed. Once again, the official leadership of the labour movement was reluctant to take militant action, and the initiative this time was seized by rank-and-file activists. The Revolutionary Workers' Group, which was a forerunner of the Communist Party, which established an unemployed workers' movement. In 1930s Belfast, the medieval poor law was still in place, meaning that long-term unemployed, once they'd exhausted their insurance benefits, had to undertake back-breaking work concreting the back streets of Belfast in return for a miserable outdoor relief payment of 8 shillings a week, and for those younger than me, that's 40p. The government refused all appeals for improvement. Those on what were called poor law benefits were subject to a virtual reign of terror, and they had their benefits stopped on the slightest suspicion that they were earning a few coppers on the side. Robert Atkinson, born and bred under the shadow of the Oval, was an unemployed plater, and like many workers at that time, was an unsung intellectual. He was a volunteer philosophy lecturer with the Workers' Educational Association. He had his benefits stopped on suspicion that he was paid by the Ireland Saturday Night for the publication of some of his poems. Coincidentally, one of the poems described with classic Belfast black humour the predicament of someone caught in precisely that kind of position It's fairly short, so I'll read the poem to you. "A postcard for you," said Big Billy's wife to himself as he gobbled his tea. "It says they want you at the Labour Bureau to sit on a big inquiry." Bold William said, "Now what the devil's gone wrong next?" and looked very sad and forlorn. But wifey said, "Shave, you'll have to be brave and clean when you go there the morn." He got there at 10, they made him sit down and give him a poke in the ribs. Then one man made bold to say, "We've been told that you were seen earning some dibs." "Is that finger wet? Is that finger dry?" said Billy, and then crossed his heart. But the man shook his head, and boldly he said, "You were seen hawking sticks from a cart." Bill looked like a man most anxious to swear, and jumped up from where he was sitting. Instead he just laughed and said, "Ach, you're daft. Mon dear, thon was only me flitting." In desperation, on October the 3rd, 1932, the outdoor relief workers walked off the 50 or so relief work sites in Belfast and marched to the City Hall. The police estimated a turnout of 10,000. The organisers claimed 80,000. A further demonstration was planned for October the 11th, and the local press predicted that 80,000 would march. The demonstrators were scheduled to assemble at 3 starting points: on the Falls Road and Shankle Road, and at Templemore Avenue, the traditional venue for Labour and Socialist meetings in East Belfast. But the demonstration was banned at the last moment. Marchers, when they gathered, were baton charged, and the police fired what were supposed to be warning shots. 2 marchers were shot dead. Coincidentally, 1 Catholic and 1 Protestant. The ever-reliable Belfast Telegraph alleged that Protestants were demonstrating in Catholic areas and Catholics in Protestant areas as part of a devious communist conspiracy to confuse the police. Prime Minister Craig Avon had his own conspiracy theory that the blame lay with mysterious Scotsmen and other outsiders and mischief makers who have come into our midst. But Craig Avon was no fool, and quickly came to terms with reality. He accepted that what he called real and substantial grievances had provoked many, including committed Unionists, to revolt. These included an 18-year-old Tommy Patton, who will be known to many of you as a former Shipyard worker, lifelong Glen man, and in fact a future Unionist Lord Mayor of Belfast. In response to this display of working class unity, Craig Avon offered an immediate 50% increase in benefits, and when this was rejected, quickly upped his offer to 150%, bringing benefits into line with what was available in Great Britain. This was accepted, and the strike leader, Tommy Dean, told a celebratory rally on October the 15th that the Unemployed had gained a complete victory and had written a glorious chapter in the working class struggle. The Glens played Linfield later that day, unfortunately losing 5-1, though they did go on to win the Irish Cup that year. The other footballing highlight of the 1930s was a league championship in 1931, and Fred Roberts setting a new Irish League goal-scoring record on May the 4th, or almost celebrating the anniversary of it, that year when he scored his 96th goal of the season in the Charity Cup final at Grosvenor Park. That's a record that will never be equalled. 1931 and 32 were the highlights of a fairly dismal decade for the Labour movement, and following 2 more Irish Cup wins in 1933 and 1935 for Glentoran as well. External events brought a reawakening of sectarian divisions, and as with the economy, there was no real improvement until well after the outbreak of the Second World War. The war did bring a revival in fortunes for East Belfast and for the Labour and Trade Union movement. Economically and industrially, there was a slow return to full employment, which strengthened trade union bargaining power. And after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, all sections of the labour movement, and indeed the Ulster Unionist establishment, were united in prosecuting the war effort. And as I've said, it was a common occurrence to find Unionist cabinet ministers sharing platforms with Labour and Communist leaders at military recruitment rallies and at fundraising events for the British and Red Armies. One of the largest of these joint recruitment rallies was held at Grosvenor Park, which was the wartime home of Glentoran following the destruction of the Oval by German bombing in 1941. Red Army Day was widely celebrated in Belfast at the time. In fact, it became the major event of the marching season. 12th of July parades being banned for the duration of the war. This took the form of British and Soviet army officers, together with civic dignitaries, taking the salute in front of the City Hall as the RUC band led the military march past. In 1942, all of this began to be reflected in politics when Labour Party chairman Harry Midgley won a by-election. In fact, he won 75% of the vote in the previously impregnable Ulster Unionist stronghold of Willowfield. He joined his East Belfast comrade and MP for Pottinger, Jack Beattie, at Stormont. Unfortunately, both Beattie and Midgley were political prima donnas, and even worse, Midgley was a Linfield supporter. By the end of the war, they were running their own separate Labour parties, and Midgley finally defected to the Unionist Party. This, coupled with a confused policy stand on the constitutional issue, meant that Labour made no great breakthrough in Belfast in the 1945 general election. The Communist Party did make more of an impact, even though it was starting from a much weaker electoral base. They fought the election on the slogans, "Let's build the new Ulster," and "a new Stormont for the new Britain." And they called for a united front of all Labour Communist Commonwealth candidates to form an alternative government at Stormont. They contested 2 East Belfast constituencies. Crummock, where Betty Sinclair won 25% of the vote, and Bloomfield, where Billy McCulloch, not sure if he was any relation of the tank, won 40% of the vote against the latest Lord Glentoran, who was so right-wing he was sacked by Brookborough from the Stormont cabinet. These were the years of so-called Red Ballymacarrat, and during those years there was demonstrated the huge capacity of the East Belfast working class for self-organisation and creativity. The rebuilding of a significant labour movement represented one aspect of that creativity. The Back to the Oval campaign and the rebuilding of the Oval grounds, flattened by the Luftwaffe in 1941, represented another substantial aspect. This was quite simply the building of a 40,000 capacity stadium was an incredible achievement, brought about primarily by working class volunteers who received virtually nothing in the way of state assistance, except a certain degree of priority of the allocation of steel rations. It was all done by self-help, by working class, autonomous activity, fundraising, volunteer labour, and all the rest of it. Regrettably, Red Ballymacarrat proved to be a short-lived phenomenon. By 1949, just as the new Oval was reopening, the border issue was awakening from its wartime hibernation, with the Irish Free State declaring itself a republic and launching a verbally aggressive propaganda campaign for Irish unity. By 1958, following the failure of the IRA border campaign launched in 1956, there appeared to be some prospect of a Labour revival. The Northern Ireland Labour Party won 4 seats at Stormont, including 2 of the 5 seats in East Belfast. Once again, however, no further progress was made before all prospects really of Labour revival was destroyed by the onset of the Long War, the Troubles, or whatever we want to call it, in 1970. Glentoran enjoyed its most successful period ever during the short-lived John Coleraine era of the mid-1960s. For a brief period, the Glens could hold its own with the best that Britain, Europe, and indeed the world could throw at us, including the well-documented summer of '67, when the Glens took North America by storm. However, it all ended in tears in 1968, when Coleraine was sacked in a dispute over his demand for a modest pay increase. But even without this, it seems certain that our days at the top table would not long have survived the debilitating impact of the long war or the Troubles. There have been good times since for the Glens, mainly under the leadership of the two outstanding managers of that period, Tommy Jackson and Roy Coyle. But in truth, the years since the, at least late 1970s, have been years of decline for Glentoran, for the labour and trade union movement, and for East Belfast. The strength of the trade union movement received, as I've said, a massive boost from the relatively full employment which followed from the need to maximise war production and from the post-war economic boom. But here again, the signs of weakness and decline were becoming apparent. In 1930, Harlan Wolff ceased to be locally owned and was taken over by a big British heavy industry cartel controlled by the Midland Bank. This was the beginning of the end for indigenous capitalism in Ulster, and the beginning of the drift towards becoming first a branch factory economy, and then as deindustrialisation set in, a no factory economy. There are no more big businesses or big local business people like the Coates family, the Dixons, the Harlans, the Wolffs, the Perrys, all of whom had been early benefactors of Glentoran. Instead, I fear we may now have some parasitical property developers hovering in the wings, waiting to pounce on the valuable piece of real estate that is the Oval Grounds. Equally, we no longer have powerful industrial trade unions with members capable of self-organisation, of doing things like rebuilding the Oval from the ashes, and of struggling for social improvement in ways that were common not so long ago. And all of this has had a particularly heavy impact on the industrial heartland of East Belfast, which over the past 20 or 30 years has gone from being a vibrant economic powerhouse into one of the most disadvantaged parts of our city and of our region. Now, what of the future? At times, the labour movement has been a dominant force in our society. At other times, largely for reasons outside its control, it has been forced to take a backseat. In short, for much of its history, it's been a sleeping giant. The same might be said of Glentoran Football Club, which at times has scaled the heights, but all too often has also plumbed the depths. Time and time again, it has failed to realise its full potential. Yet, like the labour movement, it has remained grounded in its working class roots, and it's remained true to its anti-sectarian aspirations. Now, will the glory days ever return? I don't know. That all depends on us and on our ability to recapture the capacity for self-organisation and autonomous activity that distinguished our forebears in the not too distant past. I hope we can do it. Thanks very much.